This is an exciting week for me as a historian and author, and let me explain why. Those of you who might be familiar with me and my work outside of this YouTube channel know that last year I published a book, American Zion, A New History of Mormonism, with the Live Right imprint of W.W. Norton. It was published in January of 2024. It received positive coverage in the New Yorker, Wall Street Journal, The Economist, Harper's Magazine, Times Literary Supplement, a number of other journals, was covered in Religion News Service and Salt Lake Tribune, and was even listed as one of the best books of 2024 by the New Yorker. I was very privileged to go on a book tour and meet so many of my readers. Across 8 weeks, I traveled to 10 different states, speaking in bookstores, book clubs, universities, you name it. It was a pinnacle of my academic career. Well, let me now tell you why this is exciting now, because this week, the first week of July 2025, marks the release of the Paperback Edition. Slightly revised, but much more affordable and smaller. Look at the comparison of how easy it is to carry around compared to the hardback. So in honor of the paperback release, which is now available for purchase, I thought I would talk about why I wrote the book in the first place, what I hope to accomplish, and how I went about writing it. I'll then finish this video by addressing one of the most frequently asked questions that came up on my book tour, which is the most interesting thing I learned while writing the book. Let's dig in. This was not a book I planned on writing. In fact, it would take a fool to want to cover so much time and so many people in so short a space. But instead, this was a book pitched at me that I eventually, one might say reluctantly, agreed to take on. The day my previous book, Kingdom of Nauvoo, The Rise and Fall of a Religious Empire on the American Frontier, was published in February of 2020, the press that published that book, W.W. Norton, approached me to gauge my interest in writing a general synthesis of Mormonism in America. And at first, I said no. One, because as I mentioned, only a fool would want to write a book like that. And two, there are already several really good books on Mormonism in America. Just 13 years ago, there was Matthew Bowman's book, The Mormon People, which is a phenomenal and short, readable synthesis that was written in the midst of the Mormon moment. If you go decades earlier, you have Leonard Arrington and Davis Bitten's Mormonism and the American Experience, as well as Glenn Leonard and James Allen's The Story of the Latter-day Saints. There are several really good one-volume histories of Mormonism, and I didn't know if I wanted to tackle that mountain at least yet. However, circumstances changed over the following months. In case you forgot, the world kind of fell apart in the late winter and spring of 2020 as COVID ravaged the world, and so many of the circumstances that we took for granted were turned upside down. For me, it meant that I was not going to be able to get into the archives that were necessary for the project I was planning to write. And further, I was forced to take on a service load as an administrator that meant I was going to be tied to my computer for the next few years. So suddenly I wanted to take on a project that I could build on the research I've already done and synthesize historiographical work already out there, and that I could work primarily from my office. So I revisited the topic, and we decided, me and the press decided to take on this work. But I had to have a justification. For a press to justify a new book, all that matters is, will it sell? That's an understandable consideration from a publisher. However, as a historian and a scholar, I wanted something new. What is going to set apart my project from previous one-volume scholarly syntheses on the Mormon tradition? And I decided that based on my own background and expertise, that I was going to focus on 3 points of intersection in American history that Mormonism could provide a lens through which to view these larger issues. And those are the intersections between religion and politics, or the constant debates between church and state, the intersection between faith and intellect. How do you believe something is true? How do you search for new knowledge? As well as the intersections between belief, belonging, and dissent. In other words, how do you define the boundaries around a religious culture? How do you incorporate the voices on the margins, not just those in the mainstream? Those are going to be my driving focuses, my priorities, my interests in shaping the story of Mormonism. And more, I wanted to use Mormonism to understand America, not merely to use American history to understand Mormonism. That was a crucial shift, at least in my mind, of viewing this story. So once setting out researching and writing this project with those key focuses, I started digging into the sources, laying out my arguments, and structuring my narrative. And I quickly identified my two primary goals in telling this story. First, I wanted to explain how Mormonism got to the point in modern America in which it is identified as politically Republican, socially conservative, and culturally diverse. That last point might be a surprise to some, but those who dig into Mormon culture know how diverse the modern Mormon image is. But all of those things were historically contingent. I wanted to show that it was never predetermined that Mormons would be Republicans and socially conservative, but rather there have been moments that might have led the tradition in different directions. And I wanted to highlight those moments of potential trajectories in order to explain how we got to the point we are now. And second, I wanted people to come away from my book with a clear understanding of how Mormon history and American history are symbiotic, that they need to be understood together. And this is actually a good place for me to emphasize that my story here is about the American expressions of Mormonism. I leave the global history of Mormonism. Remember, there have been more Latter-day Saints outside of the United States than inside for at least 3 decades by this point. But I'm an American historian, so I wanted to focus on the American story. But I wanted, say, people who know a bit about Mormon history to come away with a broader understanding and acknowledgement of how American history have shaped Mormonism. And I want those who may not know a lot about Mormon history to come away recognizing how Mormonism, America's interaction with and the development of, shaped American history more broadly. 3 quick examples on that. One is how mobocracy and the pushing of the Mormon community from one community to another in the first couple decades demonstrated the boundaries of democratic governance and societal belonging. How the debates over polygamy defined the boundaries of religious liberty in 19th century America, and the modern incarnation, the interpretations of church and state were based in these polygamy disputes. And third, how the religious right coalition in modern America and Mormonism's involvement with that moral majority coalition signified the foundations of modern day partisan divides that shape the world around us. All of those stories that are at the core of American history can only be understood when you include Mormons in that picture. Now, in order to tell the story, and importantly, to reach a broader audience of those who typically might not be interested in historical monographs, I knew I had to shape this tale carefully. It had to be a character-driven story. It had to be shaped around a narrative arc with climaxes and questions and twists and surprises. And it had to tell the story of Mormonism as an institution through the flesh and bones of the people who inhabited it. So every chapter in the book, there are 10 chapters, covers between 20 and 25 years. They have key characters, they have a narrative arc, they are shaped like a short story, and they have to be efficient and streamlined. The first chapter I started drafting. I set out planning to write 10 chapters of about 14,000 words each. The first chapter I drafted was around 35,000 words. It was then that I knew I was in trouble, that I had probably bitten off more than I can chew. In fact, the final product, right, the hardback and the paperback, these manuscripts are half what my original draft was for each of these chapters. This forced me to determine what is most important, what really needs to be said, and what fits into the broader story. And I had to cut out everything else that didn't fit. In the end, I think that made this book a much more readable and engrossing book, I would hope, even if a lot of my favorite sections were left on the cutting room floor. I also wanted the story tied to primary sources and individual characters. Every chapter is based around particular figures that I find both fascinating and emblematic of the broader world. Some of these characters are famous historical figures like a Joseph Smith or Eliza R. Snow, so to speak, but there are others who you may not have heard of before, who fit on the fringes of society but tell us a lot about the Mormon and American story. And so as a result, the reviews of my book that I was most pleased to see are those that say that this was a gripping and riveting story and that it was very readable. That meant that I hope I accomplished what I had set out to do. So when I was on my book tour, remember speaking in 10 different states in only 8 weeks, there was one question that kept cropping up in every event. And that was, what was something new that surprised you in this book? That took me a while to formulate the best response, but now I've had 18 months to practice. So here's my answer. And that's how much of modern Mormonism was constructed by a particular person in a specific decade. My book, American Zion, argues that modern Mormonism was in large part constructed by Jay Reuben Clark, a counselor in the First Presidency in the 1930s, in response to divergent cultural trajectories that several other prominent members of the faith were trying to lead Mormonism. I might at some point in the future do a video on this very precise topic, but I thought I would at least tease you on that story to emphasize both how I try to frame this book and the lessons you might get from it. When Mormonism gave up polygamy and adopted America's two-party system and started a slow and uneven process of assimilation into American culture between 1890 and 1930, there were a number of potential directions the faith could have gone. Assimilation into America could have meant a number of things. There were many different American cultures, in other words, that Mormonism, now willing to embrace the broader American public, could have latched itself onto. Let me give you a few prominent examples. In the social and political sphere, there are people like Amy Brown Lyman, one of the most influential figures in Mormon history that many of you unfortunately haven't heard of. She was a leader in the Relief Society. She was elected a representative in the Utah legislature. She was involved in many community and civic organizations, and she shaped Mormonism's social outreach as well as its Relief Society organization to be a humanitarian-based, public-facing, secular, integrative organization. She envisioned a Mormonism that was ensconced in democratic politics, humanitarian reform, and secular need. Simultaneously, there are other people like B.H. Roberts and James Talmage, ecclesiastical officers, who envision a much more progressive theology, a Mormon doctrine willing to engage the broader world of modernist scholarship, of scientific discoveries and humanistic thought, trying to create a Mormon doctrine conversant with wider academic investigations. And then, speaking of academia, down at Brigham Young University, there were figures like Franklin Harris, who was president of BYU in the 1920s and 1930s, who wanted the student body and the faculty to be engaged with the broader academic world, granting a degree of academic freedom, religious liberty, and intellectual quest, we'll call it, a willingness to engage the unasked questions without any dogmatic boundaries. Now, they weren't all the majority voices, and I could talk about several others, but they represent some of these paths Mormonism could have taken, indeed were taking, until it came to an abrupt stop in 1933. Because in 1933, a man named Jay Reuben Clark joined the LDS First Presidency. Jay Reuben Clark, who spent most of his professional career outside of Utah and not even that active in the faith, was one of the most accomplished Mormon men in the early 20th century. He received his law degree from Columbia University, worked as a solicitor for the US government, and climbed the ladder all the way to being the US ambassador to Mexico. He was also a dogged partisan in support of the Republican Party platform. He gets called into the first presidency by Heber J. Grant. He receives the invitation in 1931, is finally able to take up the post in 1933, and he was terrified when he took that ecclesiastical position at the many inroads that progressivism, modernism, and democratic politics had made in the Mormon culture. And so he set out to reshape the Mormon tradition in his own likeness and image. Within a handful of years, he laid the new foundation for the modern Mormon church. He helped implement a political realignment toward the Republican Party that is now taken for granted in Mormon history. He reined in Brigham Young University faculty and restricted academic freedom, reorienting religious education toward orthodoxy and dogmatism, which still shapes LDS religious education today. He reaffirmed a fundamentalist reading of scripture and theology, laying the foundation for the type of theology that Joseph Fielding Smith, Bruce R. McConkie, and others are going to make much more famous in the ensuing decades. And this is even touching how his response to growing polygamy and fundamentalist claims reshaped the LDS Church's response to both fundamentalists and its own history. In other words, the modern LDS Church, or those modern Latter-day Saints, are living in the church that Jay Reuben Clark created in the 1930s, that he envisioned in response to these progressive inroads. That's just one of the key lessons I try to demonstrate in the book American Zion. By the way, if you are in Utah or you can get to Utah, I will be participating in a panel at the Sunstone Mormon Conference that will be taking place at the University of Utah from, I believe, July 31st through August 2nd. On August 1st, a Friday, I will be participating in on a panel titled Mormon History in the Multiverse, where I and several other scholars will be positing how might Mormonism have turned out differently if these important pivot moments went a different way. And I will be using the example of what if Jay Reuben Clark never joined the First Presidency in 1933, how might Mormonism have evolved as a response? It should be a fun discussion. So please, if you're interested and available, sign up for the Sunstone Mormon Conference that will be held at the University of Utah. My panel is on August 1st. In many ways, this YouTube channel is an extension of my work in this book, American Zion, A New History of Mormonism. I imagine few things in my career are going to match the joy and the accomplishment that came from so many readers digging into this book, learning about the significance of Mormon history, its impact on the broader American society, and the many lessons that we can take for understanding the world that we live in today. If you're interested and you haven't read it, you can now order the paperback version wherever you get your books. Benchmark Books, a bookstore in Utah, typically keeps a large stash of signed copies if you want that. And if you do read it, I would be interested in your thoughts. In fact, if you have read it, please leave a comment and let me know what you thought of the book, what aspects stood out to you, what you wish I would have covered more. It's that type of engagement that makes this historical work so rewarding. History's never been more important than it is today. I know you're tired of me saying that, but it often needs to be repeated. History has never been more important than it is today. And these YouTube videos are fun, but I hope that it's a springboard to reading some dense, sophisticated, and layered historical scholarship, perhaps even including my book, American Zion, A New History of Mormonism.